There's something about New Orleans that feels otherworldly, a city steeped in history, its streets whispering secrets of the past. When I first arrived, I was captivated by the beauty of its old-world charm. Wrought iron balconies, cobblestone streets, and the haunting melodies of jazz echoing through the French Quarter. But there's a darker side to this city, a shadow cast by centuries of mysteries and legends. And one legend in particular has never truly left my mind. The story of the Casket girls and their eerie connection to vampires. It all began when I visited the Ursuline Convent, one of the oldest buildings in New Orleans. I wasn't there for anything supernatural. I was just a tourist intrigued by history. The guide spoke of the building's significance, but it was when she mentioned the mysterious third floor that my curiosity ignited. The windows were always shuttered, bolted tight, and rumored to be sealed with blessed nails. She claimed that the convent held something far more sinister than relics of the past. "They say the third floor is where the Casket girls' chests are kept," the guide whispered, leaning in as if sharing a forbidden secret. "And it said those chests contained something alive." I laughed nervously, brushing it off as a local ghost story. But the idea festered in my mind. That night I found myself researching the legend of the Casket girls. In the early 1700s, young women were sent from France to the French colony of Louisiana to marry settlers. They were called the filles à la cassette, or casket girls, because they carried small chests, called cassettes, containing their belongings. But rumors began circulating that these caskets held more than clothes and trinkets. The women arrived pale and frail, their eyes sunken and wary, as if haunted by some unseen force. Locals claimed their presence brought a wave of strange occurrences. Livestock found drained of blood, people falling ill without explanation, and whispers of shadows moving unnaturally at night. Some said the girls were vampires, bringing with them an ancient curse that still lingers in the heart of the city. The Ursuline nuns, entrusted with the girls' care, locked their caskets away on the third floor of the convent. According to legend, the windows were sealed with holy nails, and priests blessed the space to contain the evil within. But the story doesn't end there. Many believe the girls themselves never truly left. One evening, I decided to see the convent for myself after dark. The French Quarter felt different at night. Quieter, but not in a comforting way. The shadows seemed longer, the air heavier. As I approached the convent, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The building loomed before me, its third-floor windows dark and unyielding. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just the power of suggestion. Still, something compelled me to stay, as if the convent itself was daring me to uncover its secrets. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring up at those shuttered windows. Suddenly, I saw it, a faint flicker of movement behind the slats. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it happened again. A shadow passed by, deliberate and slow. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading. And then, just as quickly as it began, the whispers stopped. I turned to leave, my heart pounding, but something caught my eye on the ground. A small, ornate key. It was old, its surface tarnished, but the design was intricate, almost ceremonial. I had no idea what it unlocked, but I pocketed it instinctively. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the key. Where had it come from? Why was it there at the convent? I returned to my research, combing through archives and online forums. That's when I stumbled upon an old legend I hadn't heard before. According to some accounts, the Casket girls' chests weren't just containers for their belongings. They were prisons, meant to confine the spirits or entities that had attached themselves to the women during their voyage. The key I'd found looked eerily similar to the descriptions of the ones used to seal those chests. But if the chests were locked away on the third floor of the convent, how had this key ended up outside? I felt a chill run down my spine as a realization dawned on me. What if one of the chests had been opened? Over the next few days, strange things began happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was watching me. Shadows danced on the walls of my room, even though there was no light to cast them. Objects moved on their own, a book falling off the shelf, a glass tipping over on the counter. And then there were the dreams. In them, I saw the convent's third floor, its windows wide open. The shutters banged against the walls, and a figure stood silhouetted in the moonlight. She was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, and she held out her hand as if beckoning me closer. "Come," she whispered, her voice both soft and commanding. "Come and see." I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The key, the shadows, the dreams, they were all connected. But what terrified me most was the pull I felt toward the convent. It was as if something or someone was calling me, demanding my attention. I decided to return to the convent, this time determined to find answers. I didn't know what I'd discover, but one thing was certain: I couldn't let the legend remain a mystery any longer. As I approached the building, key in hand, the air grew colder, and the city's usual vibrancy seemed to fade. It was just me and the convent now, standing in the stillness of a night that felt alive with anticipation. And so, with my heart racing and every instinct telling me to turn back, I stepped toward the doors. When I returned to the Ursuline convent that night, the streets of the French Quarter were unnervingly empty. The usual buzz of tourists and music was replaced by an eerie silence. It felt as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting. I gripped the old key in my pocket tightly, unsure whether I was more afraid of what I might find, or what might find me. The building looked more foreboding than ever, its shuttered windows like closed eyes watching me approach. A dim light flickered in one of the lower windows, and I wondered if someone, or something, was expecting me. As I stepped closer, the air seemed to thicken, and my chest tightened. I reached the heavy wooden doors and hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The key felt warm in my pocket, almost pulsing, as though it had a life of its own. Summoning my courage, I pulled it out and pressed it into the lock. To my surprise, it fit perfectly, turning with an audible click. The door creaked open to reveal a dimly lit corridor. The scent of old wood, dust, and faint traces of incense filled the air. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper inside, though I saw no one. As I moved cautiously through the hall, I noticed the walls were lined with paintings of nuns, their eyes seeming to follow me as I passed. At the end of the corridor, a staircase spiraled upward, its worn steps leading to the infamous third floor. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something stronger, curiosity, obsession, or perhaps the pull of the key, drove me forward. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood echoing in the silence. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time I reached the landing, my breath was visible in the dim light. The door to the third floor stood before me, its surface carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Taking a deep breath, I inserted the key into the lock. As it turned, a low groan echoed through the hall, and the door creaked open on its own. The room beyond was shrouded in shadows, its only illumination coming from a few flickering candles placed on an altar at the center. The walls were lined with tall wooden chests, their surfaces etched with the same symbols as the door. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, and the faint whispers I'd heard outside now seemed to come from every direction. As I approached the altar, I noticed a small ornate chest resting on its surface. Unlike the others, this one was open, its lid tilted back to reveal a dark void within. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I felt it, a presence. From the corner of the room, a shadow began to move. At first, it was indistinguishable from the darkness, but as it drew closer, its form became clear. It was a woman, her pale skin glowing faintly in the darkness. Her eyes were hollow, and her lips curled into a haunting smile. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice like a whisper carried on the wind. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. Who are you?" She tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I am what they tried to hide," she said, "what they thought they could lock away." I wanted to run, to flee the room and never look back, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the darkness itself held me in place. The woman stepped closer, her figure becoming more solid with each step. "They called us casket girls," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "But we were more than that. We were chosen, marked by something far older than this city, far older than your kind." I shook my head, unable to process her words. "What are you talking about?" She smiled, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. "They thought they could imprison us, seal us away with their prayers and their nails. But they only delayed the inevitable. We've been waiting, and now you've opened the door." The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pulsing as if alive. Shadows writhed and twisted, and the air grew colder still. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I forced myself to move. I stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The woman's laughter echoed through the room, chilling me to my core. "You can't run," she said, "not anymore." Desperation took over. I grabbed one of the candles from the altar and hurled it at her. The flame sputtered as it struck her, but she recoiled, her form flickering like a dying light. Taking advantage of the distraction, I fumbled for the key and shoved it into the door's lock. It turned with a click, and the door flew open. I bolted down the stairs, not daring to look back, her laughter following me into the night. I didn't stop running until I was far from the convent, my chest heaving and my heart racing. The streets were still empty, but the silence felt less oppressive now. When I finally reached the safety of my hotel room, I collapsed onto the bed, the events of the night replaying in my mind. The key was still in my pocket, its surface warm to the touch. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The shadow of the woman's words loomed over me. "You can't run. Not anymore." The next morning, I tried to return the key to the convent, but the doors were locked, and no one answered my knocks. It was as if the building had swallowed itself whole, erasing all traces of what had happened. But the nightmares didn't stop. Every night I saw her face, heard her voice, and every morning I woke up with a new mark on my skin, small, crescent-shaped wounds that burned like fire. The days following my escape from the Ursuline convent were a blur. Sleep was no longer a refuge, it was a battlefield. Each time I closed my eyes, I was back in the shadowed room with the pale woman and her haunting smile. The small wounds on my skin multiplied, crescent-shaped, always on my arms or neck, and they burned as though they carried her essence. I avoided mirrors, afraid of what I might see behind me, and the key remained in my pocket as if it were fused to my being. No matter where I went, the oppressive feeling of being watched clung to me like a shroud. I knew I couldn't run from it. Not forever. The only way to end this nightmare was to face it head-on. Desperation drove me to seek out someone who could make sense of what was happening. The French Quarter has no shortage of voodoo shops, palm readers, and self-proclaimed spiritual guides, but I needed someone who wasn't a tourist trap. After asking around discreetly, I was pointed to a woman named Madame Rosalie, an elderly Creole healer who lived on the edge of the bayou. Her home was small and cluttered, the air thick with the scent of herbs and candle wax. She didn't seem surprised to see me, as if she had been expecting my visit. "You brought it with you," she said without preamble, her voice low and steady. I hesitated. "Brought what?" She fixed me with a piercing gaze. "The key. It's bound to you now." I pulled it from my pocket and placed it on the table. How do I break the bond? How do I stop her? Madame Rosalie's expression darkened as she ran her fingers over the key's surface. "You've awakened something that was never meant to be disturbed. The casket girls? They weren't just victims. They were vessels. The convent locked them away, sealed their spirits in the chests, and buried the truth. But you," she looked at me pointedly, "you've given them a way out." Madame Rosalie explained that the only way to contain the spirit I'd unleashed was to return to the convent and perform a sealing ritual. She gave me a pouch filled with a mix of salt, powdered brick dust, and herbs, along with a bundle of black candles. "You'll need to place these around the altar where you found the chest," she said, "and whatever happens, don't let her touch you." Her warning sent a shiver down my spine, but I nodded. That night, armed with Madame Rosalie's supplies and the faint hope that I could undo my mistake, I made my way back to the Ursuline convent. The convent was darker than before, as though it had absorbed all the light from the surrounding streets. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal the shadowed corridor. As I climbed the stairs, the air grew colder, and the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. When I reached the third floor, the door to the forbidden room stood ajar, its carvings glowing faintly. Stepping inside, I found the room exactly as I'd left it, but the shadows seemed deeper, more alive. The chest on the altar was closed now, and the flickering light of unseen candles cast eerie patterns on the walls. She was waiting for me. The pale woman emerged from the shadows, her hollow eyes gleaming with malice. "You came back," she said, her voice echoing as if spoken by 1,000 others. "Foolish, but brave." I didn't respond. My hands trembled as I placed the black candles in a circle around the altar, sprinkling the brick dust and salt as Madame Rosalie had instructed. "You think you can trap me again?" she hissed, her form shifting and flickering like a flame in the wind. "You are too late. The seal is broken and I am free." The moment I lit the candles, the room erupted in chaos. The shadows writhed violently, and the air was filled with the sound of unearthly screams. The woman lunged at me, her form stretching unnaturally as she reached for my throat. I threw a handful of the herbal mixture at her, and she recoiled with a shriek, her figure dissolving momentarily before reassembling in the corner. "You cannot win," she growled, her voice now guttural and inhuman. I ignored her, focusing on the ritual. Reciting the words Madame Rosalie had written for me, I poured the remaining mixture onto the chest and slammed it shut. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, and the room shook violently as if the entire building were about to collapse. The woman let out a final, ear-piercing scream as her form was sucked toward the chest. The lid slammed shut, and the symbols carved into its surface glowed brightly before fading into stillness. Silence fell over the room. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something chilling. The key, which I'd left on the altar, was gone. When I returned to Madame Rosalie's home, she confirmed that the spirit had been contained, for now. "The seal will hold," she said, "but the bond between you and the key cannot be broken. If it ever finds its way back to the chest, the cycle will begin again." I left New Orleans shortly after, vowing never to return. But the nightmares haven't stopped. Every so often I dream of the pale woman, her hollow eyes staring into mine as she whispers, "I'm waiting." And sometimes when I wake, I swear I feel the weight of the key in my pocket. To this day, the Ursuline convent remains one of New Orleans' most infamous landmarks, its secrets buried deep within its walls. But I know the truth. The legend of the Casket girls isn't just a story, it's a warning. And if you ever find yourself in the French Quarter, beware the shadows. You never know what might be watching. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales of the paranormal.